Welcome to the latest edition of Pass the Baton, a podcast to educate agricultural businesses and farmers on how to work through generational transfer of farms. Hi everyone, my name is Tony Catt and welcome to the latest podcast for Pass the Baton. Today we're talking about planning frameworks for succession planning. A lot of times, a lot of families find succession planning difficult, but due to the complications, the complexity of the topic at hand, it can feel overwhelming thinking about all the moving parts. There's multiple families involved. There's on-farm, off-farm children. There's a lot of different and very valuable assets involved, both operationally and passive. And sometimes people get to a point where they just go, this is all too hard and basically can have it all when I die sort of attitude, and hopefully they'll sort it out then. And ultimately today what I want to talk about is some basic frameworks and planning frameworks that can help break that down, put it into, I call it more manageable chunks, and help you get over that overwhelmed feeling of, thinking it's all too hard and it's just too big a problem to deal with. And so to start that off, a lot of times the more immediate problem with families is, and the one that probably a lot of them don't like dealing with because it's a very morbid topic, is the will, or as I've affectionately called it, is the dead plan. Now, the dead plan is what happens if the patriarch or matriarch or the mum and dad of the farm who own the majority of the assets or own the assets pass away. And what I mean by pass away, even if it just goes from one to the other, and then, or if both of them were to pass away at the same time. And a lot of people haven't structured a will or re-looked at their will for a long period of time. I still come across clients that haven't got a will at all, sadly. And if you die intestate, and while I'm on the topic of dying without a will, and then going through what I call the government prescribed conditions of what that looks like, it can be pretty ugly for families to deal with. So having a will first is paramount. Secondly, then reviewing the will that you've got is the next step. Now, a lot of times the will that you have for farming families, you pick it up out of the bottom drawer, you have a read of it, and if it says exactly as you want it to say, as though you would, but you have to assume that you pass away tomorrow, as sad as that sounds, as morbid that is, and it still says all the assets go to the right family members, the farm goes to who the farm needs to go to in the right structure, then put it back in the bottom drawer and tick it off your list. But if it doesn't say what you want it to say, then it's time to stop and think. And when, more often than not, it doesn't say what you want it to say because things change. People get married, new assets are purchased, people change business direction. There are a lot of reasons that these things change and need to change on a regular basis. So it's very important that you review your will probably at least every 12 months if you're in this complicated farming type arrangement. So the dead plan, then you need to understand that some of the assets that farming families own move through the will, and we'll probably try and we'll get an estate planning lawyer on to talk in more detail about this topic, but some move through the will and some don't, as a lot of farming families own a lot of farming land in trusts and companies, and therefore you need to understand how the different mechanics of those entities work should someone pass away. The other thing that needs to be carefully considered in a dead plan is leaving what assets do you want to leave to the off-farm children, in what are they specific assets, or is it just a lump sum of money, or is it anything at all? And also then if you leave farming assets to the on-farm children, what are the prescribed rules of that game? By that I mean, if you were to pass it over to the next gen, kids have a right to sell it within 12 months. Do they have a right to sell it in 5 years and just take the money and do something else, or do they have to then pass some of those proceeds over to off-farm children? There's various questions that come up around timing, and the will needs to be fairly prescriptive around these or a family arrangement needs to be fairly prescriptive to deal with these sort of situations. The last comment that I'll just make around dealing with the dead plan is that in formulating this plan can mean that you start to think about where you want assets to go, and who are the natural owners of certain assets. And that can lead to good conversations to deal with succession planning. And what I mean also, what I call best practice is in dealing with a will, I'm a big fan of talking to, once you've got a plan together or at least a draft plan, bring in your family and talk about it. My father passed away unexpectedly at 57 years of age. His will was problematic at best. And once there is a lot of questions that we as children had once Dad passed away, and once they're gone, they're gone. You can't wake them up and you can't ask them questions. And so it's really important that you have that conversation around what are the intentions of the will, what are the background reasons for the will being structured how it is. Involving all the parties to a will is really, in my mind, really important so that you can avoid problems down the track. And it can put cracks, if not canyons, in families where they don't need to be. And it's just simply having better communication around what's in there. Some families are afraid to do this because they're afraid of the reaction that they might get. My attitude is if we're going to have a fight about it, let's have it now. Let's talk about it. Let's get on with it, and let's deal with it now. So I know not everyone will agree with that, but I've encouraged clients to have those conversations. So dealt with the dead plan. The wills are all done, and everyone's clear on that. The next big structural plan that needs to happen is what we call the living plan. The living plan is broken into 4 components, and the living plan assumes that mum and dad are going to live from the age once they first start having this conversation, I don't know, in their 50s or 60s. What happens if you live till you're 95? What if you live till you're 105? And if I know this firsthand, is that some families and some parents just say, well, my dead plan is my living plan. Everyone's just going to have this when I die. And that's just how it's going to be. And as long as that's clearly communicated to the next generation and everybody knows where they stand and everyone knows what the implications of that decision are, that's fine. But be crystal clear with the family that the will is your living plan. And if that might happen at 80, it might happen at 90, and it might happen at 105. Whenever you pass away is when the assets and the operational pieces of the puzzle are going to move. If you want to design a living plan in more detail, it's broken up into 4 components. The first component of it, and the first domino that normally has to fall, is what I call the retirement plan. How are mum and dad going to retire? So how much income do they need? Where's that income going to come from? What assets do they want to hold on to? Where are they going to live? Who's going to take care of their aged care, should they need it, or when they need it? Whether they're going to, whether mum or dad are still going to work in the farm. So those retirement questions, who's going to pay for the caravan and the new ute to tow that around Australia? Who's going to pay for holidays? Should they happen overseas? Those questions are really important. And why I mean that's the first domino to fall is that once we get clarity around the retirement plan and what's expected there, then the next dominoes can fall through to what's the next generation going to plan for their lives. Because if mum and dad have uncertainty over their retirement and uncertainty around how that's going to look, then that trickles down to the next gen families. So they have no certainty over their plans and their children either. So the retirement plan takes a bit of effort. It takes a lot of thought. It's an emotional topic. A lot of people don't like feeling like this is, getting pushed out of the farm, or and that's certainly not the intention of it. But having a plan, whether it be in 5 years, 10 years, 12 years, 15 years time, is still crucial for everybody to have some clarity around what the picture is. And plans change. We've certainly had globally our fair share of unexpected events, and families have their fair share of unexpected events. But Having no plan at all doesn't really wash with me. Having some plan is better than no plan. And as I said, and reviewing that plan on a regular basis to make sure you're either on track or off track is really crucial. So retirement plans typically then morph into conversations around how much money does mum and dad need to live off, as I said earlier, and then contextually, where does that money come from? Do the next gen have to pay mum and dad's amount of money per annum? For how long do they pay it? Do they get paid a lump sum? Do they want to be financially independent of the farm at all, so they're not drawing on the farm? Those sort of questions come up, and we'll formulate a retirement plan. Once you've formulated that, my next comment around that retirement plan is actually sit down with the next gen, including the off-farm children and including the in-laws, should there be any, and explain it to them all at the same time. I don't like Chinese whispers. I don't like people hearing things at different times, because people hear different things from the same conversation. Their interpretations and their lens can be different. Talk about it at the same time, ask questions at the same time, and then everybody has clarity around what it is that's going to happen. So once you've done that, talk about it and perhaps agree on it from there. The second part of the living plan puzzle is a management plan. Now, I just want to reiterate at this point that all these plans can be happening concurrently. They don't have to happen in a chronological order. They can happen at the same time. But a management plan is around, trying to make sure that the next generation have the skills, the training, the knowledge to do the job that's required of them to run the business. That may involve training plans. As I said, it may involve some study. It may involve sending the next gen away to work somewhere else with a view to they come back with a different or a better set of skills, or they might learn off other farmers, for example. So that management plan is crucial, and that also includes a little bit of a look through the lens at the future about, how are mum and dad, if for example, stereotypically, Dad, how long do you want to work on the farm? Do you just want to do harvest and seeding, for example? Do you want to work 40 hours a week? Do you want to work 20 hours a week? How do you want to get paid? What are the parameters for that in terms of holidays? And all those sort of planning for the future things need to come out in a broad conversation. When these conversations start, a lot of people use the phrase, and I hear it quite often, Tony, I don't know. and I don't know is okay, and I don't know is acceptable, but I don't know, but I'm going to think about it, and I'm going to come back to you with some thoughts is probably the better way of approaching it, because I don't know all the time, again, doesn't help formulate a plan. And so make sure you start thinking about these issues. Make sure you start thinking about what your ideal world is going forward in an operational and a management sense, and who's doing what. What's my role? Who's looking after the HR side of the operation? Do they have the skills to do it? Who's looking after the bookkeeping? Who's doing the grain marketing? All those questions come up and do need answering, and need a framework for deciding who's doing all of those jobs. Third part of the puzzle is what I would define as who controls the checkbook. And what I mean by that is it's an operational ownership transition. A lot of farming families have the land, which is a major asset, sitting in either a trust or a bunch of structures that are different to where the trading entity operates out of. And what I'm talking about here is the transition of ownership of the trading entity in whatever that sits in, a company, a trust, in a partnership, and moving that over what timeframes, over what conditions are you moving the trading entity or the responsibility for the trading entity to the next generation. And that may then look like it may happen in percentage terms over time. It may happen all at once. And the implication of that decision is not just about who controls the day-to-day decisions out on the operational side of the farm, but who controls the decisions around the money. And to put that into context, if the farm makes $500,000 net profit, who makes the decisions around where that $500,000 goes? Do we buy more machinery? Do we put it away into FMDs for a rainy day, ready to buy more land? So how does that money get allocated? How does that money, do we pay off debt? Do we look at decisions like that, and who is ultimately in charge of those decisions? And that's a really crucial point where mum and dad then transition that decision making on the profit or the loss to the next generation. And that needs discussing, that needs clear debate around how that works, because a lot of the times the buck's got to stop with someone in the decision making, and that needs clarity about who that is and when that is. The last part of the puzzle in this living plan arrangement is the ownership of the land. And I normally find this is people get too ahead of themselves with this part of the plan. They put this probably a bit too early in the conversation. A lot of next geners are in a hurry to own the land and control it. But ultimately, I think some of these other parts that I mentioned earlier, these other plans need to be satisfied and dealt with in advance of this. But the land ownership is still a crucial part of the puzzle, in that then you get control over when you borrow, how you borrow, maybe potentially just satisfies a little bit of, I suppose, personal worth, in that you then feel like you own something, and that can help your succession planning for the next generation after that. But that land ownership transition through trusts or through companies, and the time frame around when that land ownership moves over and that control needs to be discussed and needs to be written down and debated and put into a formula. And also, in a sense, what needs to be considered is what happens if things go wrong. So risk management around that ownership needs to be discussed. What happens if someone gets divorced? What happens if someone dies? What happens if, around risk management, if we get sued, all those risk management issues around who owns land, and therefore asset protection, as I would call it, becomes paramount. Families sometimes discuss keeping land in bloodlines, such as they might then not, they want to protect against it disappearing down other family paths. And as brutal as that is, that's the truth that some families bring to the table. So land ownership is a really interesting issue. Parents are very protective over land ownership. And one of the things I see with what delays that land ownership is making sure that the next gen are committed to farming. Are they in or not in? Have they just got 1 foot in and 1 foot out, or are they 2 feet in? Do parents often want to hold on to land for a reasonable amount of time for security over their retirement? They like having that safety net or that backstop. They might want to own 1,000 acres just to make sure that, if anything goes wrong with the share market or the property market or their income stream, that they've got something to fall back on. They might require it to use as collateral for aged care facilities or to pay to get into aged care. There's various reasons why parents talk about holding on to, if not all the land, but some of the land for a period of time or an extended period of time. And again, these are questions that come up in conversations. These are debates that need to happen. And people don't have answers all the time. This is not a quick process. These conversations don't just happen in a couple of hours and you debate it and it's all done and dusted and you think, right, great, I've done all my planning, I'll just get on with it. These things can take years, and they can take multiple conversations, and invariably do. And they invariably involve multiple emotional conversations, because people's expectations of each other sometimes are way off beam. And people's assumptions of what's going to happen are sometimes way off beam. And, the communication around these plans and deciding what these plans are really important. And they need to be written down. And that's where the other thing that I would really encourage people who are listening to this to do is minute your meetings or record your meetings. Write them down, because people have really vague memories. People have poor memories of conversations, and trying to go back to a succession planning conversation you had 6 months previous, it's hard to remember what was said. What did mum say and what did dad say? And ultimately, they're important conversations. People have really important views, and they need to be recorded so that you can go back, recap. This is what was agreed, or this is what was said. So there's no misunderstandings. There's no he said, she saids. And you slowly build this dialogue of events and plans, so that if someone does pass away unexpectedly, or someone, even dementia is a really interesting issue where that creeps in now, that where people become ill really quickly. You don't want to be left second guessing of what people's intentions are or wishes were. You want it clearly documented, want it discussed, and you want it in a framework where everyone's on the same page. So make sure you don't rely on memory for these things. They're the major plans. As I said, living plan, dead plan, chunking it down into more manageable pieces and not trying to do it all at once means that you will probably move forward in some way sooner rather than later. And you become, a lot of clients who I talked about this then become a little bit unstuck. It helps just concentrate on areas of the succession planning conversation without trying to solve the whole thing at once. It really then helps people take what can be, and I guess in a broader sense, very complicated with a lot of moving parts, as I mentioned earlier, into just putting it into a simpler framework where they can just put one foot in front of the other. And just the final point that I'll make about this framework is it takes time. I think that particularly next-gen family members tend to come in and think this is a quick process. We just need the document, Tony, just so we all know where we're going. And can we just build this out in a couple of meetings? The real truth of it is it doesn't happen like that. People take time to have these conversations. People need time to digest these conversations. Some farming clients have never thought about some of these questions, and they're only dealing with these questions for the very first time when we raise them in these meetings. And it's very unfair to expect that some generational farmers are just going to come up with a plan overnight. And because they are very emotional, people shouldn't be expected to make decisions on the spot. You know, it is really crucial that we give people time and space to ruminate on these and take time, because you technically really only get one crack at this succession planning, and let's just get it right. And the drama, I get it, for the next generation is they're sort of between a rock and a hard place. They want to getting on with their lives and getting on with their stage of life and saying we want to grow a business or an asset for ourselves so that we look after our wife or our kids. But at the same time, they also don't want to look too pushy, because they're still very respectful of making sure mum and dad are okay. Mum and dad have worked very hard to help pass on a great business to them. And therefore they get a bit stuck in that no man's land between looking too pushy and perhaps being too passive and not wanting to be, taken I don't want to say for a ride, but, where 1 year turns into 5 years and no one's done anything, and it feels like some planning opportunities have been missed. Really be respectful of one another's perspective on this succession planning. Seek external help if you get stuck, and that can often bring an unbiased, unemotional context to these conversations, which invariably helps. A lot of families work their way through it. Thank you for listening today. That framework's really important. Feel free to reach out if you need to discuss it in any more detail, and make sure that you keep having great conversations with one another and honest conversations with one another, and a lot of good will come from it. Thanks for listening today.